Namaste. Aloha. Welcome to the Wisdom of the Bhagavad Gita class. My name is Janapati Das, and I'd like to offer my respects to you for tuning in. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to offer my respectful obeisances unto my spiritual master, Jagat Guru Siddhaswarapananda Paramahamsa Srila Prabhupada, and to His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, who translated the Bhagavad Gita as it is, the 1972 version that we are using. So, that being said, we are going to read some verses today, read the purports by His Divine Grace, and discuss a little bit. But before we do that, I'd like to encourage you to join me for some Kirtan. Kirtan is the process of hearing and repeating sacred mantras. And mantras, if you're not familiar with mantras, come from two Sanskrit words, man, which means the mind, and tra, which means to draw away. So the mantra is a spiritual sound vibration that when you placed in the close proximity of hearing the mantras or repeating the mantras, helps draw our mind away from the hassles and problems of this material world and place it in the spiritual dimension, because the mantras themselves are not normal sound vibrations. They're actual spiritual sounds, names and attributes of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Sri Krishna. So, that being said, please engage with me in the chanting of Kirtan. And this process you can do as you like. You can sing along with me, or as we normally do in a Kirtan session with people. We have a Kirtan leader for myself. I'll be leading. You can listen, sit back, listen, let the sounds wash into your ears and rest in your heart. And the second time through, sing back with me. Krishna, Jai Shri Prabhupada. Haribo. I was born in the darkness of ignorance, and my spiritual master opened my eyes with the torch of knowledge. I offer my respectful obeisances unto him. Haribo. Welcome again to the Bhagavad Gita class. We will be reading today we are going to read from chapter 15. So if you have this Bhagavad Gita as is, and you have a copy, you can follow along if you like. If not, then I recommend make sure you get the 1972 version. For those of you who are not familiar with looking for copyrights, maybe everything is done online nowadays, I don't know. You go to the front, at the bottom of the paper page, and make sure it says copyright 1972. That is the best edition. Unfortunately, some changes were made post Bhaktivedanta leaving the planet, passing on his disciples anyway, don't need to go into that, but basically they changed things that should not have been changed. So this is the best. Then they started fortunately reprinting this. Okay, so we are going to read from chapter 15. Chapter 15 is titled The Yoga of the Supreme Person. And it is a conversation, of course, between Krishna and Arjuna on the battlefield of the Kurukshetra. I'll read some Sanskrit because I've been doing these reading through the Bhagavad Gita and been reading. I'm not a Sanskrit scholar, but it's very nice to hear the words. Mamai vasho jiva loke, jiva bhutaha sanatana, mana shashtan indriyani prakriti stani karshati. I'm going to read through some of the translations and go back and read the purports. But the translation for that: the living entities in this conditioned world are my eternal fragmental parts. Due to conditioned life, they are struggling very hard with the 6 senses, which include the mind. Text 8. Shaliram yad avapnoti yachapi utkrama tishvaraha. Grit vaitani shamyati vayor gandan ishvashyat. The living entities in the material world carry his different conceptions of life from one body to another, as the air carries aromas. Text 9. Shrotyam chakshuhu sparshanam cha lashanam grihayam evacha adhishtaya manaschayam vishayan upashevate. Let me say that word again. Upashevate. The living entity, thus taking another gross body, obtain a certain type of ear, tongue, and nose, and sense of touch, which are grouped around the mind. He thus enjoys a particular set of sense objects. Let's read one more verse. Text 10. Ukramanam tam shtitam vapi bunjayanam janjayanam va gunan vitam vibmuda nanu pashanti gana chakshushua. The foolish cannot understand how a living entity can quit his body, nor can they understand what sort of body he enjoys under the spell of the modes of material nature. But one whose eyes are trained in knowledge can see all this. It's a great verse. A lot of great verses, a lot of subject matter. We have been reading about the Bhagavad Gita in these classes, and maybe perhaps you've read the Bhagavad Gita or read through the purports by His Divine Grace. Lots of really wonderful topics that we're discussing: the reincarnation or the transmigration of the soul, the attempt to enjoy in the material world, in this conditioned world, and different elements of material energy and spiritual energy. So we're going to go back to our text 7. And the living entities in this conditioned world are my eternal fragmental parts. Due to conditioned life, they are struggling very hard with the 6 senses, which include the mind. So Krishna actually brings this up in a famous verse, or Bhagavad Gita verses are all famous, really. But in text 7, chapter 7, text 4, earth, water, fire, air, ether, mind, intelligence, and false ego, altogether, these 8 comprise my separated material energies. Besides this inferior nature, O mighty armed Arjuna, there is a superior energy of mine, which are living entities who are struggling with material nature and are sustaining the universe. And then we have this again here in this verse, text 7 of chapter 15, the living entities in this conditioned world are my eternal fragmental parts. Due to conditioned life, they are struggling very hard with the 6 senses, which include the mind. So, a lot there. As we know, Arjuna has been making a lot of different arguments about why he should not fight in this battle, all based on a material conception of life, which is what most living entities, jivatmas, or the spirit souls, as we really truly are in this material world, try to struggle with the material energy, thinking that is who they are, identifying with the material energy that is our body and our mind, these different elements: earth, water, fire, air, ether, mind, intelligence, and false ego. So we have a very gross material energy, and then we go into subtle energies, some that we know of the gross elements in material science, right? Earth, water, fire, air, ether, which is space, right? But then we have mind, intelligence, and false ego. In mind, we think, in science, we'll be like, okay, the mind is actually some activity that happens in the brain, but actually many scientists and the Vedic conclusion is that the mind is not an agency of the brain. It is affected by what goes on in the brain, and the brain is affected what goes on in the mind, but the mind is considered to be, actually many scientists don't know, but they've done these studies where, in surgery, they can't find where the mind is. They don't know what it is, but they falsely conclude that the mind is somehow a product of the brain, which it's not, because a lot of examples have not been shown that the mind is something else. And we can go into that a lot, maybe in another class. It's a big subject, but basically, sometimes in surgeries, people have been conscious during surgeries and certain things that are going on in their mind. Normally they should not be conscious, or they not be aware of these things that are going on when they're stimulating different parts of the brain. And they're like, so that's one example. This happens quite a bit. But here it says, the living entities in the conditioned world, in Lycan's chapter 7, it was stated that there are these inferior energies, material energies of gross matter and subtle matter, but yet there is a superior energy, which are the living entities, which are the jivatmas, who are struggling hard with the material world. And here it says they are struggling very hard with the 6 senses, which include the mind. So these different kinds of energies are struggling with the energies, not just trying to enjoy the material world, but struggling with their own mind, struggling with their senses. And Krishna in chapter 2, Krishna makes a point to Arjuna that the senses are very impetuous, and the mind is very strong, that it can drive people away who are very discriminating. In other words, they know the difference between spirit and matter, that they're not matter, but yet they're still affected by it. And so his conclusion is that you should focus your mind and your senses, do your work in service of me, of Krishna, Krishna consciousness, instead of for your own pleasure, which is what Arjuna was trying to do by wanting to go off to the forest and not follow the instructions of Krishna to fight the battle of Kurukshetra. He was thinking it would be better for me to renounce and go off to the forest and be a renunciate. In his mind, it was a renunciate, but Krishna then explains what real renunciation is really about, what it means to be a renounced sage, which is to dovetail your senses and your mind in the service of Krishna, to focus it on Krishna. So, this is being said. In this verse, the identity of the living entity is clearly given. This is Bhaktivedanta's purport. The living entity is the fragmental part and parcel of the Supreme Lord eternally. So we have words like, ashamya in Sanskrit, which means fragmental particles. And sometimes it's thought of that when you fragment a material object, it breaks away from the original object and makes the original object smaller. And so this is a Mayavadi or an impersonalist yogi conception that the living entities are really just the one whole who have broken away, and that the Supreme Lord is incomplete because he's fragmented himself into many pieces. However, this idea of fragmented is not not breaking away. It's not, in the case of Krishna, 1 + 1 is 1. It's not, or 1 - 1 is 1. It's not anything, less. And this is a really hard conception to apply our material mind upon a spiritual conception of, when we think, well, if we take one away from one or away from a whole, then it becomes less. But this is a spiritual conception. Krishna is eternal, ever existing. We are eternal and ever existing, but we are also fragmented. But we are the same, Achinta Veda Veda Tata. We are the same, simultaneously one but different. In other words, we are the same energy of Krishna, but we are not the supreme. We are not the supreme dominator, which is how we tend to want to live in this material world, as a supreme dominator. It is not that he assumes individuality in his conditioned life and his liberated stage becomes one with the Supreme Lord. He is eternally fragmented. It is clearly said sanatana, which means eternal. Right? According to the Vedic version, the Supreme Lord manifests and expands himself in innumerable expansions, of which the primary expansions are called Vishnu Tattva, and the secondary expansions are called the living entities. In other words, the Vishnu Tattva and his personal expansion and the living entities are separated expansions. So, very interesting. So there's different energies that are Krishna's energies. The Jivatma are Jiva Tattva, not Vishnu Tattva. In other words, they are spiritual in essence, non-different in quality than the Supreme, but different in quantity. Let's see. This is a long purport. We can just read parts of it. The living entities, not only the human beings and the cats and the dogs, and even the great controllers of the material world, Brahma, Lord Shiva, and even Vishnu, are all parts and parcels of the Supreme Lord. They are all eternal, not temporary manifestations. The word kashati, struggling or grappling hard, is very significant. The conditioned soul is bound up as though shackled by iron chains. He's bound up by the false ego, and the mind is the chief agent which is driving him in this material existence. When the mind is in the this is I like this when Bhaktivedanta talks about iron chains. One thing I remind, even though it's not a perfect analogy, is this allegory of the cave by Plato, in which there are living entities in this cave, or there are humans in this cave who are bound by iron chains, and they are looking at a wall, and behind the wall is a fire, but what they see is the reality, is the shadows, and they think the shadows are the reality, and until they can come and have somebody release them from their iron chains to see that actually the fire is what's creating the shadows on the rocks in front of them, and that there is an actually higher reality outside of the cave. So there's much more to this analogy, but it's not a perfect example, but it is close to this idea of being shackled by iron chains, which is bound up by the false ego, which in Sanskrit is known as ahankara. It's considered to be a subtle material energy. It is this false ego. They've translated it as false ego, which is really interesting because there's a lot of chitty chat in sort of pseudo spiritualism about losing your ego, or kill your ego, or but or deny the ego, or all these sayings about somehow that the ego is this kind of bad thing that if we need to get rid of in order to realize the higher reality of being one. This is Mayavadi impersonalism. It's basically just stating that we are actually one energy. It's but there is an ego. It's called the Jivatma, and the Jivatma is a spiritual entity. The fragmental part is the eternally the same individual. That is you, that is I, that's all the living entities in different bodies in this material world. And ego, real ego, jivatma, understanding, self-realization of who you really are is essential in this material world, and especially in this form as a human that we have right now. We have the capability to inquire into these matters about who am I. Now the ahankara is translated as false ego because it is stated that the jivatma falsely thinks himself to be his mind, his senses, and his body. He thinks that he's a body. He thinks that the designations, like my name is Janapati Das, my English name is James, I'm a middle-aged white American, I'm a teacher, I'm whatever, all these designations. Everybody has these designations, and when they're asked normally of who am I, this is what they answer, and this is what they think of themselves as. But early on, Krishna makes this point to Arjuna, never was there a time when I did not exist, nor you, nor all the kings that you're worried about getting killed on the battlefield, nor in the future shall any of us cease to be. So he makes that statement early on and goes on in chapter 2 to explain that the material body and the mind is not the living entity. It's not who we are. It's like a shirt, just in the same way that our shirt is not who we are. It's what we're wearing, what we have in this material world, in this particular life. And anyway, in this chapter, it does go into more about the nature of these living entities. And so it says here, the living entity carries his different conceptions of life from one body to another as the air carries aroma. So in chapter 2, verse 14, Krishna tells Arjuna, after he says, never was there a time when I did not exist, he says, as the embodied soul continually passes in this life, from boyhood to youth to old age, the soul similarly passes into another body at the time of death. So this is setting up the idea that the living entity is reincarnating, is transmigrating through the bodies, and that the sober person, the person who understands this, is not affected by the changes coming and going, the ups and downs of the material world, just understands it for what it is. And here Krishna is telling Arjuna that the living entity in the material world carries different conceptions of life from one body to another as an air carries aroma. So sometimes, you walk into different places, maybe by a dump, it has aroma, the smells, right? It's carrying from the dump. Or if you're walking by a fish market, you smell fish. I used to, when I travel overseas as a Peace Corps volunteer, I'd go to the market, they'd have meat markets, it would be like, it just smells of meat. But, there's also nice smells, you go by a bakery and there's really nice vegan bakeries and you have the aromas. So anyway, I hit my point, So these aromas, right? So basically in the living entity in the material world, acting under ahankara, or the false ego, thinking he's a material body, is acting in the material world, thinking that person, that this body is who we are, and that our goal in life is to try to satisfy or be happy. The goal of being, the goal is really bhakti. It was reinstating our loving relationship with Krishna, which is really what makes us happy. But in the false conception of life, we think that happiness drive, that desire to be happy, which is normal, is actually redirected towards material things. And so that's karma. That's karma means action. So our activities that we do in this material world engages ourselves, and we have reactions to the things that we do, good and bad, right? We were obviously killing things unknowingly. We might be eating, if we're eating meat, we're killing living entities. We're getting reactions for that will be fructifying later on in life. And so this is a conception of reincarnation. So, because the next verse says, the living entity thus taking another gross body obtains a certain type of ear, tongue, and nose, and sense of touch, which are grouped around the mind. He thus enjoys a particular set of sense objects. So in this life, we're in a particular, every living entity is in a particular form. I'm in the human form. I have a cat. He's in the cat form. We have living entities. We have in mosquitoes and bacteria and many kinds. Hundreds of thousands of forms of bodies that they can take on. And they all have a particular group of ears and noses and tongues and senses of touch, as it said here. Now, maybe some living entities don't exactly have a tongue, but they have a tasting apparatus that they can taste it, or they have a nose, they have a way of smelling things, they have a way of touching things and scent. So it may not be our hand just exactly like our hand, but it has, you think about different things like an octopus, or they all have different ways of interacting with the material world in their particular bodies. But in this life, most specifically in the human form of life, where we have the capability to inquire, to find out about self-realization, we can inquire about who we are. We can act in a certain way that will cultivate our relationship in a spiritual way. You can't really do that in any other form of. You can't do that in any other form of life. Octopus or dog or bacteria, they're just living their life, eating, sleeping, mating, and defending in that particular desire. So in this life, as a human, we have a very grave responsibility to understand what our purpose in this life is about and what we should be doing. Otherwise, we're just acting out in a certain way, and we're accumulating the karmic reactions, which are grouping around, because as we said in chapter 7, right, we had the gross material energies and we have the subtle material energies, and then there's the Jivatma, and the Jivatma is wrapped up in all these different coverings. And the way, when we act, we get certain reactions, and we are shaping the types of ears and tongues and nose subtly in our mind, which is in the subtle body. It's a subtle energy. We're using our mind to shape not just our mind, but also the gross physical body that we are working towards in our next life. Now, that most likely in a human form of life, where we're not using it for self-realization, could be anything, hundreds of thousands of different kinds of living entities, depending on what we use our senses and our mind for in this life. We may come in and maybe shaped into our next life as an octopus or as a tree, so this is a very big subject, and there's a lot of, in the Bhagavad Gita as it is, there are a lot of particulars, including like the modes of material nature, material energy, and what it is, what the living entity is, and what the different energies of the living entity is, and what our duty is, and so many things that are really wonderful in this Bhagavad Gita. So I recommend reading a little bit every day and contemplating it. And so I think we read all of our... I'll read a little bit of purport. In other words, if the living entity adulterates, so this is the living entity taking on another gross body, obtains a certain type of ear, tongue, and nose and sense of touch, which are grouped about the mind, he thus enjoys a particular set of sense objects. In other words, the living entity adulterates his consciousness with the qualities of cats and dogs. In his next life, he gets a cat or dog body and enjoys. So, human form of life, as well as every other form of life, has the propensity to eat, sleep, mate, and defend already. We have to eat, we have to sleep, sometimes we have to mate if we get, have children. We have to defend certain things in different kinds of context. And dogs do that. My cat A cat doesn't. He eats all the time. He wakes me up in the middle of the night to want to get fed. He like eats, just wants to eat all the time, you know. When he doesn't eat, sleep. I think cats sleep 18 hours a day. I mean, I thought I slept a lot. Eating, sleeping, mating. Well, I don't know. With cats being neutered, that may not be happening. But usually that's what the case is, right? Defending. Oh yeah, cats defend all the time. They're territorial, you know. My neighbors have a cat. It's kind of funny because my cat's name is Nitai and his cat's name is Balaram. So, but they get into territorial things, and sometimes Nitai comes with like cuts and stuff. He's like defending his territory. This is and they go out and they stalk. You know, so humans do that too. We have that capability of doing those kind of things, but we have the capability that cats and dogs don't have, which is to say, why is this going on? Why is this happening? Who am I? What is the reason that I'm in this material world? Is there a God? You know, what happens? You know, the philosophical inquiry and an ability to act upon those inquiries. So it's really important that we do act on that, or most importantly, to try to find a living entity who knows the truth about that, which is our spiritual teachers, and who can help answer questions about spiritual matters in this material world. Otherwise, we just go about eating, sleeping, mating, defending, thinking that, well, this is me. This is, you know, this is my enjoyment. This is my wife. This is my job. This is my, you know, car. This is my. This is mine. You know, and without really knowing what are we talking about when we say this is my whatever, right? So this is very wonderful. So reading some more from this purport. Consciousness is originally pure like water, right? And so when we apply our consciousness, when we apply our mind and everything, and we come to the point of Krishna consciousness, of focusing our consciousness on Krishna, that is the originally pure consciousness, but it is perverted when we come into contact with material nature. But if we mix water with a certain color, it changes, right? Similarly, consciousness is pure, for the spirit soul is pure, but consciousness is changed according to the association of the material qualities. Real consciousness is Krishna consciousness. Yeah, Bhaktivedanta said it. When therefore one is situated in Krishna consciousness, he is in his pure life, but if his consciousness is adulterated by some type of material mentality in the next life, he gets a corresponding body. He does not necessarily get a human body again. He can get a body of a cat, dog, hog, demigod, or many other forms, for there are 8,400,000 species. Yeah. So Krishna, you know, our relationship with Krishna is the source of all purity and all love, and all things come from Krishna, really. But if we are going to try to do this life without Krishna, then we will come into contact with the material nature. Just like Bhaktivedanta says, you mix what is pure already with something. It's like putting like clouds in front of a sun. You think, oh, the sun is gone, but actually the clouds have come in front of the sun. When the clouds move away, the sun is already still there. So very wonderful. I think we'll stop there, because this is, you know, the Bhagavad Gita as it is coming, like, you know, my spiritual master would say, you know, spiritual life is coming into a banquet of just a huge spread of wonderful food, and after you've been starving, you just take a little bites at a time and just cherish it and apply it in your life, and it's very wonderful. So we're going to do some more purifying with our chanting of Krishna's names. Please join along. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Hare Rama, Rama Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Hare Hare. Jai Jai Gurudev, Jai Jaya Gauranga, Jai Jaya 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 Gurudev, Jai Srila Prabhupada, Jai Jai Gurudev, Jai Jai Srila Prabhupada, Jai Jai Gurudev, Jai Jai Srila Prabhupada, Jai Jai Gurudev, Jai Jai Srila Prabhupada. Haribo. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful night. And see who is in there. Haribo. Namaste, everyone. Thank you.